Hello and welcome to We Turned Out Okay. I am Karen Locke Hope. I'm the host of this show and I'm the founder of WeTurnedOutOK.com. And with me today is a returning champion to the show, Jessica Lahey. Hello, Jessica.
Hello.
Jessica is the author of two amazing books. The Gift of Failure is Jess came on the show a couple of years ago to talk about that. That is episode 54 of We Turned Out Okay, and I will link to it in the show notes if you want to go back and listen to that. This is a whole different conversation today, which I'm so excited to get into. It is all around Jess's new book called The Addiction Inoculation. I should also say Jess writes for the Washington Post, the New York Times, lots of other really cool, the Atlantic Monthly, really, really cool places like that. And initially, in fact, when we first got to talking, it was because I had read an article of yours about that had to do with the gift of failure, but it was how you got into writing that book. And this book, to me, The Addiction Inoculation, was such a wonderful idea of yours. And I first got a hint about the content, I think maybe even before you had started writing it. Years ago, you wrote an article, I think it was a New York Times article, called "What I Gave Up to Be a Writer," something like that.
I think it was a blog post of just on my website. Yeah, something had to give is what it was called.
Something had to give, and I will find that and link to it in the show notes. I'm just writing down the name of it right now.
So yeah, I'll send it to you afterwards. Cool. So you have it.
I was like, oh, what did Jessica give up? And it turns out it was quite serious. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the blog post originated with, this is a cool story too, is it was at a Mom 2.0 summit. And the Laura Mays, who runs Mom 2.0, one of her good friends is Jenny Lawson, who has written Furiously Happy and Let's Pretend This Never Happened. And she has a new book coming out later on the same day as mine, on April 6th. And I've already read it. It's absolutely wonderful. Anyway, so Jenny was reading early copy from Furiously Happy and was scared to death. And Furiously Happy is about her mental illness. It's, she goes deep in that book. And so she and Laura were talking about how, revealing that stuff is so difficult, but it's ultimately the most rewarding stuff. And she was talking about sort of, the idea of dragging all the scary creatures out from under the bed and revealing them one by one. And that was my big scary creature under the bed, was my drinking. And so I stopped drinking right after I got the book deal for The Gift of Failure, because my dad came and sat on the end of the bed after that one night when I stayed at their house for my mother's birthday party. And I had gotten completely plastered the night before. And he sat down and he said, "I know what an alcoholic looks like. He grew up with them, and you're an alcoholic and you need help." And at that point, I had no excuses, because I knew at that point how badly I needed help. Yeah. And so that night was my first 12-step meeting. But yeah, that blog post, everyone talks about there's something you have to give up for your writing. And I knew that I couldn't drink and write at the same time, that if I continued to drink after I got my book deal for The Gift of Failure, it was going to be a disaster, that I would never in a million years meet my really short deadline. The writing would be crap. I was a full-time teacher too. So when is all this being drunk and writing and teaching going to happen? I had to keep them separate, and there's only so many of those things you can do in one day.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's interesting. I love that you bring up the story of your dad sitting at the end of your bed. First of all, I love that you talk about this so forthrightly, but also you talk about it in a genuinely empathic way. I mean, you really have, you're such a good writer. So I want to bring you the story of a few weeks ago. I had just started The Addiction Inoculation, and I literally read the words where you're telling about your father sitting on the end of your bed after you'd gotten completely plastered, and what he said. And that night, and I do have permission to tell this story. So that night, my 16-year-old, my husband and I discovered that my 16-year-old was going to need to, we were going to need to stage what we called an intervention around screens. And what is really interesting about that is I was able to use the language from your book to help him see like the big screens in the pandemic have become a huge problem. Now, what I also want to say is that we have since, I have since spoken with Devorah Heitner, who is
I was just going to write her. I was just getting out my pen to write down the name, Devorah Heitner, to remind myself to, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
so
good.
she, I asked her about, you know, because my son wanted, he said, you know, Mom, I'm feeling a little bit condescended to. Like, I don't think I have an addiction. I'm really, so we were really using that language.
Right.
And so I asked Devorah, like, you know, he had asked for some stats on screen time and addiction. And I was like, you know, can you help me with that? And the first thing Devorah said was, and I love this, she said, I think we need to be really careful about the words that we use around screen time and screen addiction. She said there are some things that are in the DSM, like gaming, you know, gaming disorders and that sort of thing. And so I took that back to my son, and I said, okay, so this is what Devorah Heitner tells me. I said, you know, and I told him, I said, I feel appropriately like understanding now of the language that we need to use. And he goes, validation. He puts his arms up in the air. Yeah, like, you know, but the thing, well, and I guess the thing is, when we initially had our initial conversation, I brought your book up. He told us that he felt so relieved that someone was stepping in.
Oh, good.
And in a very similar way,
because that is not always the case.
Right?
As someone with a lot of experience with kids in recovery, that is not always the case.
Yeah. And so I guess I really, first of all, I wanted to ask about, you know, if what is addiction and what isn't? Is there some kind of a line or a slippery slope, or like, how do you feel about all that?
This is a really complicated question, also because you've brought the screen stuff into it. And so first of all, there's like, for me, there are conversations that we can have about the science. There are conversations we can have about semantics. There are conversations we can have about turf, and all of those things come into play with substance abuse. And whether you want to call it, you know, first of all, just the wording, like, you know, we're not supposed to call it addiction. Of course, that's the title of the book, because you try coming up with a catchy title of a book that uses the term substance use disorder. It's just really difficult. So all the wording has changed around it, even in the style guides, like the AP style guide is completely changed. You're supposed to center the person, not the thing. And then what is addiction or substance use disorder? Is it a brain disease? Well, there's a whole camp over here. And then there's a whole camp over here that says that it has to do with, it's a developmental disorder. I mean, there's, and a whole other camp that's like, it's just a response to trauma. I mean, it's just self-medicating. It's just, you know, there's so many different places that we can come at this. And then on top of that, you mentioned the DSM, you know, some people are like, well, if you're talking about gambling or screens, or that's not addiction because there's no chemical being introduced in. It's just messing with the chemicals we already have in our body that are just functioning on our reward centers, which people who create games, video games they're capitalizing on sort of the way to get the brain to squirt out dopamine and how that happens and all that stuff. So this is an unbelievably complicated question. And no matter how you address what is and what isn't addiction, there are going to be people screaming at each other. But in terms of the other part of your question, which is, you know, what is use, what is abuse? Because there's use, there's substance use, and, you know, approximately 90% of the humans on the planet have no problem using a substance here and there. You know, obviously plenty of people, my husband included, can drink, and it's just, you know, whatever. And, so there are about 10% of the people who on this planet who, you know, if they drink or use drugs, are going to have a specific response that's different from the 90% and are going to just be really keyed into that substance, whether they sort of go, oh my gosh, that's what I've been looking for my whole life, or wow, that really soothes my anxiety, or whatever that thing is, and have trouble stopping.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, you know, there's the question of whether or not something that doesn't use a substance at all, what isn't about a substance even, is a form of addiction. So the use, and then their abuse, you know, plenty of people who, there's that very hazy line. And for various people, it's going to be very different, the line between use and abuse. And lots of people can abuse for a short period of time and come back. Lots of people can abuse without spiraling completely out of control into a full-blown substance use disorder. So where that line, and that's why, books like Holly Whitaker's Quit Like a Woman is so great, because Holly talks about the fact that, look, what we're talking about, let's say alcohol breaks down into alcohol essentially is ethanol, one component of it. And ethanol is what we put in our cars. It is toxic to our bodies. And so it is not particularly useful to talk about, whether or not you have a substance use disorder or whether or not you're abusing. You need to look at what that substance is doing to you and to your body. Is it getting out of control? Is it affecting your work? All those kinds of things. And she said, plus, if you take one of those tests, am I an alcoholic, and you're kind of not quite there yet, maybe your score is on the lowish side, but that it's affecting your life, being able to default to, oh, well, I didn't score high enough on that test to have like a full-blown, I'm not an alcoholic, because that test I only had a 4 out of 10, so I'm not an alcoholic. But on the other hand, it's affecting my life in a negative way. And so I think Holly is correct in that. And that there's a certain utility to being, for me, it is reassuring for me to be able to say, I am an alcoholic, which means I cannot drink at all, period, zero, zilch, zip, because if I do, I can't stop. So for me, it's easier for me to have it completely off the table. Gretchen Rubin talks a lot about abstainers versus moderators. For abstainers, I'm an abstainer. It is easier for me to abstain 100% than try to dabble, which is good, because moderation for people like me just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I hate to not give you a really clear answer. I mean, in our family, I can tell you right now, because of my kids' genetic predisposition and epigenetic predisposition to substance abuse, which is about 50 to 60% of the picture for substance use disorder, we don't have a ton of conversations about use. We talk a lot about what the difference between use and abuse looks like, and what it feels like, and how much are you looking forward to that party this weekend and that kegger, or how does it make you feel when you wake up the next morning and you've had a couple too many drinks and blah blah blah. That's sort of those kind of conversations they need to be really paying attention to, that line between use and abuse, because they're just more susceptible to it than 90% of the population.
Yeah. And I think about, like, going back to Jay, my little guy. He's not so little anymore, he's 16. But one of his first questions, there's a couple of things I wanted to say that just came up as you were talking. One was he said, well, what did you do with Max, who's now 20, our older son? What did you do with him when he was 16? And I said, well, he didn't have the same exposure. Like, they're just 4 years ago, there were not the same thing.
Yeah.
Number one. And number two, we were not in a pandemic. So he wasn't 16 in a pandemic. He's doing it at 20 very differently. The other thing is that we've really focused, and again, this is thanks to Devorah, the language around it especially, is we've focused on habits. Like, so he has we are stepping in and saying, it's time to hand over the mouse. It's time to hand over the cell phone right now in this. And we're expecting that, what we will do over the coming weeks is we will help him reinforce those habits for himself. We're thrilled because he's already noticing, like, for a while he was eating dinner in his room. He was just not ever stopping the screens. And it actually started because he isolated in November due to COVID. So he spent 2 weeks alone in his room, and we never came back from that, basically.
Yeah.
And so the other day he said to me, he was sitting down at dinner, and he said, I will never watch dinner, and I will never eat dinner in front of the tube again. He's like, this is so much better. And he said, he told me that he started carrying his phone around everywhere, including into the bathroom.
Yeah.
And he just wasn't present in his life. And he's noticing that just after a couple of weeks. I mean, it's such a thrill to see that. And I one of the things I want to get into is habits. The listeners generally to We Turned Out Okay have kids who are sort of elementary aged or younger. So this is really at the beginning of that spectrum. And I know dinner focuses very like mealtime, shared mealtimes really focus is a big focus of yours. But before we get there, there was something that I really wanted to talk about that comes up early on in the addiction inoculation, and that I think is really important for parents whose kids are young to think about, to be starting to think about. And that is the idea of you talk about Chris Herron, the basketball star.
Yep.
And one of the things he says, he is a recovering alcoholic, and he says, we focus on the worst day and we forget the first day, oftentimes when we're talking about people with addiction disorders and that sort of thing. And I love the idea of, why did it get started in the first place? And I wondered if I could, in addition, kind of ask you to share about, like, what was the first day for you?
Well, it's funny, there at 12-step meetings, you hear a lot of stories. I mean, that's the nature, especially my home group was a 2-speaker discussion meeting on Sunday nights. So I would hear 2 stories every Sunday night. And, there are a lot of them are like, the exciting part is the bottom, like, how bad did it get, and a lot of people also tell the story about, like, oh, I never felt like I had the rule book. Everyone else knew how to do this being a human on this planet thing, but me, and I've never felt good enough. I never felt present in my life. I never felt like I was accepted. And then I had that first drink and I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. Like, this is the thing for me. Or, David Sheff's son, Nick, talks about the first time he had methamphetamine and he was like, oh my gosh, this is what's been missing from my life. And he had tried lots of other substances, but methamphetamine really clicked into the receptors for him. I didn't really have that. Like, I had substance abuse in my family. I was scared to death of it. So yes, I do have, I remember the first time I was, I sort of was pressured into drinking, and I kind of faked it, but she didn't. And she got really drunk, and she actually ended up dying of liver disease very young from her alcoholism and other things. But for me, it was a slow creep, and it didn't happen until my 40s. And part of my picture, I think, has to do with anxiety. When the drinking was getting heavier, my anxiety was under control-ish, but alcohol actually exacerbates my anxiety because it would wake me up in the middle of the night, and I would have anxiety attacks in the middle of the night, not just regular anxiety attacks from my anxiety, but anxiety attacks about the fact that I was drinking too much. And I would wake up every night at 2 or 3 in the morning and promise I wouldn't do it again, but then I would do it again. And I was like, oh my gosh, here I am again doing this thing. And we had a tiny house, and you could hear every creak and every step. And so if I needed to barf, it was really horrible and scary. And so the more that anxiety ramped up, the more I drank to deal with that anxiety. And as I became more and more published as a writer, I was a full-time teacher, and I was writing regularly for the Atlantic and the New York Times. And that was a lot of pressure. And and I'd been treated for my anxiety disorder, but it was just a lot. And then when you add the alcohol on, it exacerbates it. So I don't have that like first drink story where, it's very clear this was first drink and I was at a party and I didn't feel like I fit in. I don't have that story. I barely drank in college. I was an alcohol educator in college. So that's one thing I like about my story, is that I think since I started telling it, a lot of women have said, oh, that's weird. I didn't start drinking until late in life and didn't have a problem with it until my kids were of a certain age and all that sort of stuff. So I think this can just sneak up on us too. It doesn't have to be like a,
yeah. And that's what I was thinking about too, is while this was ramping up for you, while you were teaching, while you were getting published, you were a mom as well.
Yeah.
You've got 2 littles, right?
And at one point, actually, I was also nannying for a third because we couldn't afford to live where my husband was doing his fellowship for infectious diseases. And so we lived in someone's attic, and, for a very long time. Well, and I also am one of the lucky ones, because my story is a lot of not yets, a lot of those bad things that were going to happen, the DUI, the me being drunk at school, the me, none of those things happened to me. I still had very clear lines around school, and I had very clear line, I wasn't drinking until after I got home, so I was really scared because I knew those lines were going to get blurrier and blurrier. No pun intended. So yeah, that was really, really scary.
Was there a sense of powerlessness to that?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I would find myself at the store to buy the bottle of wine without really having thought about it. So like, yeah, the powerlessness was pretty clear. Yeah. I had every day I had a plan about how I was going to make it work and how I wasn't going to drink too much that day and blah, blah, blah. And every day those plans just, you know, just didn't happen the way I wanted them
Yeah.
to.
This is something that, so I think when we're small and the adults around us say things like, oh, you just have no idea the pressure that they're under, or
Mhm.
you don't know, you know, and you really don't as a kid. But
Right.
as I've gotten older, what I've noticed is a sort of insidiousness to this,
Mhm. Yeah.
and just the idea that like you could look away for a moment and find yourself at the liquor store thinking like, well, here I am. You know, and
Well, yeah, and the people in my family, and there's a lot of substance abuse in my family, and there's substance abuse on my husband's side of the family. And, you know, when I think about the reasons why some of those people drank, some of them had fantastic reasons for drinking. Like, you know, man, if I had to go through what that person went through, I would drink too.
Mm.
So, you know, it's also hard to, there's, there's never this like clear cut, you know, as we know as writers, there's not like a Voldemort who's just all bad. There's
Yeah.
hardly ever a clear cut, this is bad and that is good. And you stay over here and there's just lots of stories that make it really easy to understand. And I think it's also important to realize that, you know, when I taught for 5 years in the drug and alcohol rehab for kids, and the kids would look at me every single time and we had a lot of turnover at the school because kids were going in and out. So I was often introducing myself to new kids week after week. And without fail, the kids would look at me and they'd say, well, you don't look like an alcoholic. And I think it's really important to realize that there are a lot of very together perfectionist, you know, people very achievement driven also who, you know, as part of the pressure to be perfect and achieve and all that stuff also need to put that anxiety somewhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Good point.
yeah.
I learned for the very first time reading your book what the definition of gaslighting is, and I was so grateful to you because it's come up, and I can't, I just kind of can't keep a grip on the meaning. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And so what you write is that well, actually, it was Susan Cheever who wrote this.
Susan Cheever originally,
Yeah.
and but it's absolutely it's funny because if you had asked me if I grew up, like if you were to ask me, by the way, about my childhood, I'd say I had an idyllic childhood. I really had a wonderful childhood. My parents adored me. My parents trusted me. It was great. If you had asked me, you know, were you gaslit as a kid? I would have said, oh my gosh, no, no way. I had a great childhood. And it wasn't until I really started looking at what actually was happening that came up.
Can you talk about what gaslighting is and how it pertains to substance abuse?
Yeah. So kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They're also a lot more perceptive than we give them credit for. I tell the story in the book about a girl. I worked in pediatric HIV research a long time ago. And there was a girl in the service in the pediatric HIV service, and this was in the early 90s. So this was still, you know, tons of stigma, you know, and it wasn't, you know, kids just didn't live very long. And so we didn't want her parents didn't want her to know that she had HIV. So no one told her. So it was a big secret we kept from her. Everyone kept from her. But the truth is she knew the whole time. She knew she was sick the whole time. And she told us not to tell her parents because she didn't want them to worry. That happens with substance abuse too. Like there are certain things that still trigger me. Little hints that someone may be drunk, like, you know, repeating things, the flush in the cheeks, you know, a certain way of talking. And I knew what all those clues were and I knew what it meant. And so when I would say, I think this person is drinking too much, to be told, no, that's not what you're seeing is really emotionally disturbing. And, you know, I talk about this with gift of failure stuff too. You know, we've always thought that you build a kid's self-esteem by telling them over and over again how wonderful they are. And no matter what, you tell them how smart and talented and perfect they are. But then if they're struggling at school and they come home and they say, this doesn't make any sense to me, I don't understand what's going on. And you say, well, that shouldn't be the case because you're so smart and you're so talented and you're so wonderful. What you're telling them is, the reality, I'm going to explain to you why the reality you're experiencing is wrong. And you're just not seeing that. And that is not only upsetting, it breaks down trust. It also makes kids question themselves and their perception of reality. And then when you get to an age where you're like, no, I'm really quite sure that is what I'm seeing, then animosity just starts to build. And, you know, I grew up in an extended family where we were just supposed to, especially in my very extended family, where we were supposed to just ignore the fact that that person was pretty much passed out. You just don't talk about that. That's just, and that's, you know, telling someone that what they are perceiving is not what they are perceiving is gaslighting. You know, and with the recent administration, that was in the media a lot because Trump would say, no, there were, you know, 1.5 million people at whatever at that gathering. And then you would look at the television and you'd say, that doesn't look like 1.5 million people to me. But essentially what they're saying is the way you perceive your world is not correct. And it's been done to women for, you know, forever, you know, being told that we're hysterical, you know, all that sort of stuff. So that just really digs at a very soft spot as a woman, to be told that my perception is off, that's not what I've seen. It was really, really difficult as a kid.
And you quote Susan Cheever, who says, pretending that things are not as they seem makes children crazy, because like you say, children are so much smarter than we give them credit for. And I think too, the idea of gaslighting comes with and as a person of privilege, like I really think I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of racism and racial inequality, because I relatively early on in my show, probably about 3 years ago, I interviewed a biracial couple. Their names are Hamilton Graziano and Ingrid Ali. And Ingrid is Black, and she shared about her experience. Like she went to a mostly white high school, and she had teachers tell her, you know, well, that you're wrong. Like, that's not how this event happened. And she's like, but I'm not wrong. Like, you can't. And people would say that about her literal experience. And she
that's why Kelly Wickham Hurst created the organization called Being Black at School. She was a teacher and then a counselor at school, and kids would come to her, the Black kids would come to her, and they would say, I'm seeing the teachers treat me and the white kids differently. Like, I could do something and I would get in a ton of trouble as a Black kid, but the white kids wouldn't get in trouble. And Kelly would bring this to the attention of her administrators, and they would say, no, that's not happening. And so Kelly ended up being this incredible resource for the kids, where they just needed someone to say, yes, what you are seeing and perceiving is actually happening. But the idea that someone would say that there is racist stuff going on at this school was just so untenable that she was let go from her job. And so she created Being Black at School as a resource for parents and educators to talk about those sorts of issues that, you know, she's hopefully multiplying her effect. You know, she can't be in the classroom right now. And so she's running, you know, Being Black at School. I suggest you check it out. It's really, really great. But that experience, she said, you know, imagine what that does to the mental health of a kid, that over and over and over again, you see that you're being treated differently than white kids, and for white people to be telling you over and over and over again that what you are perceiving is not happening. That will turn you crazy. It will make you nuts.
And it'll make you not trust any who's going to do that. It'll make you not trust a lot of grownups.
Well, and then imagine what happens when we're like, okay, well, great. If we can just get this, you know, racism on camera, maybe if we had it like, you know, officers treating, you know, during an arrest, killing someone of color, if we can just get that on film, man, that'll end it, right? Because that'll be proof. And then we have situations where, you know, people are saying, no, that's not what you're seeing. What you're seeing is not what you're seeing. And, you know, that's, gaslighting is just so damaging.
It really, really, really is. And it can be such the basis for a child's experience with things like substance abuse disorders. Kind of bringing us back to here. And I think one of the things I love most about this book is it's so you. It's so It's so practical. And there are first of all, there's such compelling stories in it. but then there are like these, in each chapter, there are these like, here's a whole bunch of things you can do. And you can choose like a couple of them. You don't have to do them all, right? Like, but so for example, the one I really glommed onto was, and I wanted to ask you about a very specific dinner in your home, if you'd share that with our audience. You talk about how meals, the power of shared meals is like, it's a time where people's barriers come down in time. And, or, you know, for us, it's dinner time. For other folks, it might be a different meal. In fact, I know families that they cannot, well, in the pre-pandemic, they couldn't eat dinner together. So they would, or any meal. So they would come together at 7:30 for dessert. Like they spent time together around the table as a family. It was so important. And it's an addiction inoculant.
Well, and I'm clearly, this is not like my idea. And the other thing that you have to realize about the dinner thing, that, you know, there is research that shows that if you have dinner together, kids are less likely to have a whole bunch of negative outcomes. But, you know, I'm married to a statistician. And every time I hear something like that, I have to stop. And I'm like, okay, what are the confounders here? Who's more likely to be able to have the time to all sit down for dinner together? Well, it's not someone, you know, who's working 2 jobs. It's going to be less likely that it's a single parent trying to make ends meet. So at a certain point, you know, we have to be a little bit critical about those things. But the reality is that dinner time is not always about the dinner. It's just about that opportunity to, you know, look each other in the eye, have that check-in daily. And so while dinner is what you're talking about, I think there are other ways of getting at that aren't necessarily like, you know, an hour and a half to sit down at dinner around a table.
Yeah, you reference ski lifts are fabulous.
Yeah.
Driving in the car is also great.
But the meeting the eye thing, that's the magic of the ski lift, though, is that sometimes it's easier for kids to talk to you when you're not looking them in the eye. Yeah. In fact, I have a friend who is a therapist, and sometimes if her patients are just being really, it's difficult for them to communicate, she'll actually let them text her in the same room over the phone, because that sometimes is easier for them. So something about a ski lift and being side by side and not having to make eye contact, or being in a car side by side, that there's something kind of magic about that too.
Yeah. And I'm remembering that talk about that therapist was making me remember there have been times in my kids' lives where they've brought me their phones and they've said, I want you to read this.
Yeah. Yeah.
You couldn't say it. So, you know, so they could read it. Anyway, and you say this too, and I think we both know this from our educations, but any way that you can get a child to drop their barriers, you know, you got to meet them in their territory.
Right.
And so, you give this wonderful example of like gamifying dinner to really get to know your kids. And it had to do with a show that you all love, that the 4 of you love. I forget the name of the show. It's
called Hot Ones.
Hot Ones. That's right.
Chris Evans is the host. It is, it's on a network called First We Feast. You can see it on YouTube. It also is on television. But we watch it on YouTube. And Chris Evans just had this idea that if you could interview someone while you're eating successively hotter hot wings or vegan wings, you can sort of knock someone off their game a little bit and get deeper than the superficial questions. And so as someone who interviews a lot of people, I would watch Chris Evans do this and say, oh my gosh, he is so good at that. Like there's so many moments where people say, oh, no one's ever asked me that question before. He also does incredible research. He researches like crazy. I don't know where he gets his information, but it's also those wings that kind of knock things off kilter a little bit so that people are willing to open up because they're suffering inside their mouth.
And you basically recreated that interview process with the progressively hotter and hotter wings with your sons.
Yeah,
they were adult, well, not adults.
And it was a secret. You have to. In our house, it worked really well that I kept it a secret. Like I ordered the sauces from the very specific place where that Hot Ones works with, and got this full season lineup of sauces, and went and got unseasoned wings. I guess I could have made them, but it was a lot of wings. Unseasoned wings from a wing place, and then tossed each of them, and then had them all sitting out. And my husband and I had planned well in advance. We had questions that we thought really long and hard about. Like we didn't want to dig too deep. We didn't want to embarrass them. We didn't want to seem like we were prying, but the questions were fairly open-ended and asked them to relate things about themselves or observations that helped us understand our kids better.
Yeah. And as someone who has sat with, teenagers and 20 somethings at the table, it can be so hard to get them, like, they don't want to play, my kids anyway, don't do well with high-low hero anymore, which is the game where you
Yeah.
talk about a high in your day, a low in your day, and then who was a kindness hero for you that day.
We had high-low funny.
So
Yeah.
something that happened that was funny
Yeah.
that day. Oh,
Yeah.
you know what? That might actually
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
We should try that
And
one.
in schools, they do roses and thorns, it's whatever iteration. But yeah, my kids are old enough now, and we've been doing that for so long that, sometimes I toss it out as like every once in a while. But, I have a 22-year-old and a 17-year-old, and the eye rolling is extreme now. And,
Yeah.
in order to really engage them, it had to be something that I absolutely knew that they loved and that they would find interesting. And, on New Year's Eve, since we couldn't go anywhere and everyone was trapped at home, I went to a craft store and bought paints and canvas and asked them each to come to dinner with 2 photographs or just images that they liked. And then we had a painting evening, and that was really fun too. And that was a surprise. So there's something about, sometimes you can just admit that this is a goofy parent thing we're doing, but you have to make a real attempt to meet them where they are and
Yeah.
find the thing that will interest them.
Yeah. And it doesn't often involve food. We, I guess it was a couple of months ago now, we went to a very specific restaurant in Western Massachusetts. We got takeout from it because my husband and I had been there previously, and we were like, they're going to love this. We need to get out of Dodge. So we went, it's like an hour away from us or so. And we took a walk across the Connecticut River on like this big, cool trellis bridge thing, just outside of Northampton. And we chose things that we thought they would be like, well, I've never seen this before. And we went to this chicken place, and like, they were just blown away, and we're sitting in the car sort of eating chicken, and they're just like, oh my God, this is the best. And it was such a blast. And then we actually took 2 walks that day. So the second one was, we went to like a wooded brook sort of area, and like, we would have thought it was almost as if they hadn't been to a place like this ever.
Yeah.
Like, they're sort of watching the river and they're talking to each other. Like, it just brings out conversations that you don't usually get to have. So just changing up the venue a little bit. I think what I might do, instead of hot wings, what I might do is, maybe we will have a sort of like cookie tasting or something like that, because
tastings work really well. We did recently, we were arguing over we have chocolate chips in the house, not just for baking, but like for a few, my husband likes to do for dessert every once in a while, just like a spoon with some peanut butter on it and then dip it in some chocolate chips. So we often will eat chocolate chips out of hand. And so we were trying to figure out which ones we liked best. So we did a bit of a tasting with the chocolate chips. That kind of stuff can just be really fun. It's just something different and weird. Yeah.
And even if, like, we talk about this a lot on this show about how just cooking with kids, if you can say to a kid like, hey, can you come and make sure there's enough salt for me? Does this need more salt? And it just engages them in a way that, because you're asking their opinion, you're showing them some kind of respect, and they will take that very seriously. And that can be really fun when you get to, the level of like, here are some cool questions, and we're gonna talk around all this kind of cool stuff. I would love to get into a little bit. For me, I noticed there were some places in the Addiction Inoculation where that book really kind of melded in a beautiful way with the Gift of Failure.
Yeah, there was a definite dovetail situation going on.
I wondered if anything occurs to you that where that happened.
Yeah, after working with the kids at the rehab and noticing that a lot of them had just a real lack of self-efficacy, not because they weren't competent or capable out in the world, like they'd often had to fend for themselves since they were young. Some of them were raising siblings who, because their parents were addicted to substances themselves. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like the feeling like, I want to change what's going on in my immediate environment. I want my parents not to be using anymore. I want to be able to move out and get my own place. I want people to stop hating me, and not being able to do anything about that situation. And that, lack of self-efficacy, or in other terminology, learned helplessness, the feeling that over and over and over again, you get it clarified to you that no matter what you do, you can't make things better. And that's at the root of when Shane Lopez in his book, Making Hope Happen, talks about the definition of hope. He says, the definition of hope is seeing that your life can be better and that you have the power to make it so. So a lot of people can envision how their life could be better, but having that feelings of self-efficacy, the feeling like you can actually make a change in your life, is something that a lot of kids are missing when they aren't given much power or aren't given autonomy, aren't helped to feel competent, aren't helped to feel like, aren't supported. Mm-hmm. And so there's that dovetail there from Gift of Failure, and I realized very quickly that one of the things I could do for my students in the students in my rehab classroom were often high school students who were just years and years behind where they should have been, mainly because they were either in group homes and had moved a lot and had undiagnosed learning issues. I'm not going to make up all that turf for them, especially not in the however many weeks they're in my classroom. But I can, number one, get a book in their hand and get them reading, try to reignite some love of learning if they ever had it. And then the other one is help them do things like, I would have them watch this video called Follow Through. It's a documentary on that REI made, starring Caroline Gleich, who was a former student of mine. She was in The Gift of Failure. She is a professional free skier and sports model and mountaineer. And she did this thing with REI where she said, one of the things she really wanted to do was ski all of the shooting galleries in the Wasatch, all the shoots in the Wasatch Range. There's like 40 of them, and it's called the Shooting Gallery. So you don't just walk out your door one day and do that, right? You have to learn about avalanches, especially since her stepbrother died in an avalanche in one of the shoots in the shooting gallery. So you have to get trained in avalanche safety. You have to be a better mountaineer. You have to be a really good skier. You have to do all these things. And so in order to have this big goal and achieve this big goal, you have to do a lot of smaller goals. You have to achieve a lot of smaller goals in order to get there. So we would watch this documentary and I would ask my students to just go crazy, come up with some huge goal what is your wish? What is your goal? What's your big life goal? And they would write it down and I'd say, okay, that is so cool. A lot of them, it was like, I want to be a rap star or whatever. But for some kids, it was realistic. One kid said, I want to work on an oil rig like my uncle. And that's doable. I can help you get there. So what do we do now? Well, now that we know what your big goal is, let's go figure out what the smaller goals are that you have to do to get there. And obviously for them, it often started with staying sober. And helping them say, and giving them actual tools like, okay, maybe a good idea would be for you to write a letter to that person who has that job and say, what did you have to do in order to be, to get a job like that? Do you apprentice? Do you go to a class? What do you do? Yeah. And so we would, helping them see that in order to achieve these big goals, you have to achieve lots of smaller ones first. That boosts self-efficacy and that gets them to a place where they do feel like they have some power to change their lives. And that was my biggest job as their teacher, I think, was giving them a sense of self-efficacy and help take away some of the learned helplessness and help them move forward towards bigger goals. And I think that dovetails with a lot of the research on competence and resilience and all that stuff that was in Gift of Failure.
How wonderful for them that here's an adult who can say both, I am an alcoholic or I'm a recovering alcoholic. I don't want to put language in my mouth. But also who can help them. So is there a lot of empathy in that work?
Yeah, I think, I actually wrote about it for this collection. I wrote a story that was an essay that was in this collection called This is 40-ish. Went back when I did qualify in my 40s, edited by Lindsay Mead. And in there, I wrote about how one maintains empathy in this situation and doesn't resort to getting pissed off for them, because often what kids in that situation who have been betrayed by a lot of adults in their lives will do is test you first. I mean, that's right. Who am I to walk in there and say, hi, I'm your teacher, now do what I say. What they would do is poke and poke and poke and poke and poke in the hopes that you would get pissed off and send them out of the room so that they could say, see, I told you right there, another adult has left me. Yeah. So And I made that mistake once, and I lost that student permanently. Like, I was never getting her back in terms of having any relationship with her. So once I got pissed off and I sent her out of the room, it was over. And I just decided I got to figure out how to never, ever let that happen again. And part of not letting that happen again is having empathy for their situation. And I think a lot of people look at these kids and say, you know, they're just bad kids. They're, you know, they're addicts, they're junkies, da, da, da. You know, why don't they get some control over their life and get a job? And I don't think people can begin to understand what these kids have gone through. You know, when the CDC comes up with its adverse childhood experiences scale and of 1 to 10, you know, if you give these kids a quiz and ask them about what they've experienced in their childhood, it's, you know, it's everything. It's, you know, sexual abuse, physical abuse, you know, parent who was, you know, involved with substances as well. And so, you know, and a lot of helplessness, a lot of feelings like, you know, why bother? You know, this one kid said to me very specifically, I asked them to write essays about how they see themselves, and then another essay about how other people see them. And he was willing to write the one about how he saw himself, but he was not willing to write the one about how other people saw him. And he got really, he just withdrew. He just went inside, which meant that, you know, something was going on for him and from a trauma perspective. And thank goodness for trauma-informed teaching and some training I've gotten around that, because instead of getting pissed at him for not doing the assignment, I could get at why he wasn't doing the assignment. And after some talking, he revealed that there was no reason to do that one because everyone assumed he was going to go to prison. Like all the men in his family had gone to prison. So why even talk about it? And then once after he told me that, he was angry that he had revealed that and angry that he'd opened himself up. So then we had a whole other, you know, level of emotion going on that he didn't know how to deal with because he'd been using drugs for so long to mask his emotions. And then that led to a whole other outburst. And, you know, I think the understanding there has to be there for me, because I couldn't possibly work with those kids unless I had some ability to do some perspective taking and understand where they're coming from. Because many of them are just very, very broken people, and it's not their fault. Someone else really broke them and broke them bad. And I don't know how some kids recover from that. And many of them don't.
And so I had thought, I'd been thinking about the idea where these two books meet of, you write, don't solve the problem for your child, right? I think that's a pretty important tenet. And then I hear what you're saying now. And I think most kids, fortunately, most parents, fortunately, who are listening to my show, to our conversation, will probably not have a child who needs some kind of inpatient, you know, therapy, right? But that doesn't mean that the children in question don't have big feelings that should be acknowledged, that should be talked about. So where's the connection between not solving their problems for them, between, I guess, firmness and the idea of fostering trust? I mean, I have some thoughts on how all that goes, but I would love to hear your perspective, you know?
Yeah. So when you look at the other thing we do have to acknowledge is that we're in the middle of a pandemic when kids have even less control over their lives than usual. And a lot of us parents, adults, have less control of our lives than usual. I can't stop that threat out there of the pandemic to my kids, to my parents. I haven't seen my parents in forever. And, you know, it just kills me. I want to fix all that out there, and I can't. So a lot of parents, and myself included, sometimes I've been micromanaging cleaning this house because that I can control. I can exert more control inside because I can't do it outside. So I've got to do it somewhere. So I'm doing it inside. And for a lot of parents, that means more control over the kids, more sort of micromanaging school because a lot of it's happening here in the house anyway, or, you know, cleaning and that kind of thing. And so it's exacerbating the fact that a lot of kids already have much of the control taken away from them. You know, so it's even worse than usual right now. So I think, you know, for me anyway, it all comes back to two really simple mantras, which is focusing more on this the fact that this job is a long haul job, that the emergencies that happen today are small things. What we need to think about is how we do better next time, how I get my kid to a place where in 6 months they can handle this themselves and have a sense of ownership and power over it. How do I get my kid to a place where they have self-efficacy? How do I get my kid to a place where they can advocate for themselves so I don't have to jump on the email and talk to the teacher for them? All of that sort of long-term focus in parenting. And then the other one, which is, something I talk about with Gift of Failure all the time, which is focusing more on the process and less on the end product. And I think that works for me as a mantra because it works with trauma-informed teaching. It works with, why is my kid screaming at me right now? I'm really freaking out because my kid is screaming at me and I can't figure out why. And that means that it's probably not about something that is obvious to me. And I've got to figure out a way to be patient and calm and let that reasoning come out over time. I think, being quick to say, you're being disrespectful, therefore you are grounded for the next 2 weeks. That's not necessarily going to get you to what's actually causing that explosion. And we've had stuff come out since the pandemic. We've had some big changes in our family that I'm not allowed to talk about that, have really changed the nature of some of the identity of some of the people in our family and the way we react to each other and the way we talk to each other and the way we understand each other. And I don't know that, and some of it was preceded by bad behavior because those are challenging, scary things to bring up around the dinner table.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of trust that they will be supported no matter what, that I love my kid, not some other imaginary kid I wish I had, and that we trust in them to make good decisions. I'm really proud of my kids for, I hate to say using their words because they're older teens and young 20s, but for feeling like they can talk about that stuff. And I'm really proud of the atmosphere we've created in our home where we can talk about things that can rattle the bars a little bit, and that's okay. And that's all about focusing more on this long-term process, and less on sort of, okay, well, what's the end result of this? Because some of the things that have come up and I hate to be, but these are kids, I'm not allowed to talk about this stuff. But some of the things that have happened, I don't know where we're going from here, but that's part of it too. That's part of our process too. These are people who are emerging into their adulthood, and we may not have answers to some of these questions for a couple of years, and I can't rush that. So focusing more on where we are today and getting to a good place in 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever, that has to be my focus. Otherwise, I'm just going to drive myself crazy with needing to control everything because I do like to control things. I love to control things. And that's just right now for those of us who love to control things. I have a book coming out on April 6th during a pandemic. All the things I would normally do to make this work don't work right now.
Yeah.
And it's really, the lack of control that all of us feel. I can't get my parents a vaccination appointment. I can't, my husband's been vaccinated, but I can't get vaccinated. When am I going to get vaccinated? All these things that I wish I could control. Can't right now.
So much of it comes down to literally that. What can I control? And I would like to take us out on a story relating back to my son, because so much of what you talk about resonates. And I can see people listening, taking from our conversation and taking some inspiration into their own lives, So the 2 or 3 days after we implemented our new screen time rules, I found him curled up in his room under all the blankets and holding his teddy bear. And I was like, I got angry at first. And I basically said, something's got to give here, buddy. And I closed the door louder than I ordinarily would because of where I was. And as soon as I did it, I was like, wait a minute, forehead smacking, you gotta, no. And I opened the door back up and I went and sat in the bed and I said, I'm sorry that I shouted, which I didn't actually shout, but I'm sorry I spoke harshly. I said, what's on your mind? And because we do have a trusted relationship, he was able to tell me, and we were able to come up with a way for him to do what needed to be done that worked for both of us. And it was such a relinquishing of control moment where I was like, this is his life. I've got to try and be supportive of his needs, his ideas, his hopes. And I think that's true whether our kids are 3 or 30
Yeah.
or
I think
13.
it's also important to remember that during this pandemic, a lot of kids are doing comfort measures that look a lot like regressing, like reading books that they've read lots of times, watching. We had a period of time where my 17-year-old went back and watched movies he loved as a little kid. And he watched them with his 22-year-old brother, and they had a blast. And I think it was the most animation we've watched in this house in ages. And it was just, it's because it's comforting to them. And when you can't control much else, at least you can control, you know how the movie's going to end.
Yes.
Predictable. And
Yes.
that's what comfort books do. That's what comfort movies do. That's what, and let them have that. That's really, really important, because that's what will calm and comfort.
It's why I read Regency romances, that I know the ending is going to be happy.
Why I reread Jane Austen every year.
Well, Jessica Lahey, I don't want this conversation to end, but I know it must. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. If you're listening and you haven't already ordered this book, go do it. It's amazing. I'm so thrilled that you've written it, and that it can be something that we can use for going into the future, helping our kids through all of the struggles that they're going to have, helping us through those struggles too. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure. It was my pleasure. You can find Jessica Lahey at jessicalahey.com. You can find her book wherever wonderful books are sold. I finally have a super special thankful thank you to the 23-time winner of the Husband of the Year Award. He's the producer of our show. It's his voice you hear at the top of the show. He is Benjamin Culp. He's amazing. And I'm just going to say a final thank you very much, and we will see you next time.